Hello, everyone. I'm Kari Vogelgesang, your host of the Educator Wellness Podcast, here to share and promote my life's work and passion, all things wellness. But not just any wellness, we're here to discuss wellness specifically as it pertains to educators. I am a former elementary school teacher, and I am passionate about helping educators see wellness in a very different way. This podcast is dedicated to educators across the globe, creating a space for us to come together in an authentic and therapeutic way, sharing our stories, our hopes, our joys, our fears, our sorrows, and hopefully creating some space to share some laughter with one another as well. In our journey to learn how to support one another to prioritize wellness and enhance our overall well-being. Please join me as we talk with nationally recognized experts to guide us on a transformative journey of self-discovery, helping us to embrace and weave all dimensions of wellness into the fabric of both our personal and professional lives. Also, please note that the opinions and perspectives that are shared on this podcast do not necessarily represent those of the Scanlon Center for School Mental Health or the University of Iowa. Today, we hear from special guest, Dr. Justin Garwood. Dr. Garwood's research and teaching focuses on students with and at risk for emotional and behavioral disorders across three specific areas. 1, pre-service preparation and teachers' use of relationship-based pedagogy. 2, academic interventions. And 3, classroom management. Dr. Garwood serves on the editorial board of Behavioral Disorders and the Journal of Emotional and Behavioral Disorders. He's a licensed teacher in English education, grades 7 through 12, and special education, grades K through 12. Dr. Garwood's research is currently funded by 2 grants from the U.S. Department of Education. He is principal investigator for Project Burn and Turn, which is an exploratory project examining malleable factors related to special education teacher burnout. He is also principal investigator for Project Resiliency, an interdisciplinary training program focused on the education of youth with and at risk of emotional and behavioral disorders. In this episode, we discuss the meaning of the terms self-contained classroom and full inclusion, something that is getting a lot of attention recently. And we also examine laws that govern least restrictive environment decisions. We also explore how different learning environments impact the well-being of not just students, but their families and educators and their peers as well. Please join me as we learn more about how self-contained classrooms and full inclusion environments impact the social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health of everyone connected to the school community. Welcome, Justin Garwood. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Kari. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me. I've really been looking forward to doing this session with you. I know that this can be a really sensitive topic for teachers and parents and students and educators, of course. So I'm really looking forward to getting into it with you and talking through some of the things that are related to inclusion in our K through 12 learning environments.
Yeah, really. I always like to include that I'm a licensed teacher. I've maintained my license, even though I haven't been in the classroom for several years, because I always want to not necessarily leave that door open, but I think it's important to keep that license and keep me connected beyond my research to schools and what's happening today.
No, I think it's really important too. I'm really happy that I'm able to keep going into schools every week and talking to teachers and visiting classrooms and really experiencing what's going on, especially since now I know you have like a whole village of children at your house, don't you? But I am an empty nester now, so I don't even have that in now in terms of going in and volunteering or.
I'll say this because my children will never see this because they're too young, but I'm so jealous. No, not really. I mean, this morning, my twins woke me up at 4:30, and then my 3-year-old got up at 5:45, and it was a particularly long, early morning. So yeah, but love them all. But it is that I have the coffee mug of the days are long, the years were short. So
it's
they
true.
feel very long right now. I'm sure for you, the years felt short.
Yeah, it's a different phase of life for sure. But I it's interesting because people are like, you're going to be so sad. You're going to be so sad. And I'm not.
I think that's fine. I mean, talk about mental health. Like you should be excited for the next phase. I mean,
Yeah. Well, and I'm excited for them.
Yeah. And we love our children, but raising children properly, it's hard work. So it's fine to be at the stage where you are and just kind of go, whew, let me take a minute or maybe a year or two and really just enjoy that as you transition to, and now they're adults and you get to be adults with them. And that's great.
So that's a really good transition, actually, thinking about the way that teachers experience, and that, we've both been classroom teachers, so the way you kind of experience our work too. I think that, educators' work is really, really exhausting. And it's like parenting in the sense that I think one of the reasons why I'm not as sad is maybe, I don't know, I'm not sad. I mean, I feel a little sadness, right? That it's a chapter of my life is coming to an end. But I also truly feel like even though I was far from perfect, because no teacher is far from perfect either, make lots of mistakes along the way, and made lots of mistakes, will continue to make mistakes, same with teaching. I think because I truly feel like I gave it my all. Like I feel like I really showed up. I tried to take really good care of myself so that I could show up as a parent, as a teacher, day in and day out. And even though I, of course, made mistakes, I do think that it helps you feel more proud and hopeful and happy and than sad.
I could not agree more. I mean, just as when I was in the K-12 classroom and still somewhat today with higher ed, but it's, my days in higher ed are not filled with 8 hours of instruction every day with students. But when I was a teacher and sometimes with my students now, you do something in a class that you're in the shower that night or that morning and you relive, you go, oh, I should have done it this way. And the same thing with kids. But, for me, the whole point you say about giving it your all and keeping yourself, taking care of yourself so you can show up. I mean, I always, at the end of my undergraduate behavior management course, I kind of have my final tips to my students, and they expect a lot of the stuff I'm going to teach them about, all the stuff we've learned. But then I have this big shot of, it's like a picture of, like a bathroom sign with someone kind of like holding it. And I'm like, what is this? And my recommendation though is like, make sure you drink lots of cranberry juice when you're a teacher, because teachers have the highest rate of like bladder infections among all professions because we hold it, because we can't go, because we're dealing with students. And it's funny, but it's also true, because if you get sick, you can't be there. So focusing on your health, physical and also your mental, I think that is, you mentioned one of the grants that I have and the one on burnout. And that really is, the argument that I made in that grant to get the funding was we can have all these wonderful interventions for students, and we should, and we do. I personally believe that we know what we need to know in terms of what works for students. What we know a lot less about is prioritizing teachers' well-being and making sure they're in the best place possible to deliver those interventions for those students who need it. And we know that teachers who are not feeling physically or mentally well, they don't do their job as well. So that was the argument. I said, we obviously care about student outcomes, but really I want to study teacher outcomes because they're the ones who are the implementers. I mean, you can build the greatest spaceship in the world, but if there's not the right pilot to get it there, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened to me. That was my whole path. Like, I started focusing on student behavior when I was doing my PhD, and it quickly shifted because I realized, oh, wait a minute. Like, unless we actually are supporting the teachers, and unless we're actually, training teachers properly and showing them how to implement interventions properly in a actually doable way, then it doesn't matter. It just won't be used. So, I mean, but when you're talking about, when you were talking about taking care of yourself and teacher burnout. So one of the things teachers, as you know, which is one of the reasons why we're here today, one of the things that teachers point to in burnout is challenging behaviors in the classroom and not feeling like they're prepared or equipped to manage or to take care of students with, extreme challenging behaviors, or even students who have really severe academic needs in the classroom. And so that's, we're here today to kind of talk about inclusion, full inclusion, self-contained classrooms, what that looks like, what those two things even mean, and how it impacts not just the student that is experiencing maybe some challenges, but the teacher and the rest of the school community as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I first think it's important to acknowledge, so when we talk about full inclusion, I think it's important to define it. I mean, because sometimes people use these. So when I say inclusion, it's different than full inclusion. Full inclusion, when I say that, and what I think the literature really says is that when we say full inclusion, we mean pretty much every kid, general education classroom, every time, all day, every day of school.
And can you stop for a minute? So explain why we have these laws in place, right? Like, sure. Explain some people might be saying to themselves, Justin, well, why wouldn't all kids be fully included?
Sure. So, I mean, going back into the law, try to make it not too boring. So one of the things we have in the law, which was regarding students with disabilities, in 1975, we had what was then called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which is now referred to as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. But this act came about to basically give rights to students with disabilities, saying that they have rights in school, just like any other student. They have a right to an appropriate education, but how they reach that appropriate education is going to require some accommodations in the classroom. And one of the kind of the pillars of the law is something called the least restrictive environment, or LRE. And LRE is really what it basically says is that every student should be included in the general education classroom to the maximum extent possible. It doesn't end at every student. It says to the maximum extent possible. And really what you're doing there when you're thinking about working with students with disabilities who have been referred for special education services, who then have an IEP team of teachers and staff and parents and advocates coming together to figure out what is the best way to get this student the best education possible, given their unique needs, their strengths, and also the areas where they could use improvement. One of the biggest things you consider is, where is education going to take place? And I think it's important to realize and remember that special education is not a place. There really is no special education place. Special education is a curriculum. It's special education is about providing access to general education, and that access can be provided in the general education classroom or in different settings. So the law says that you have to consider this continuum of placements, everything from general education all day, every day, which would be considered full inclusion, to a setting where maybe the student is getting pulled out some and getting some education in a resource room for part of the day, to a student is getting educated in a self-contained classroom within the school. So this is a classroom inside of the school building that is the students who are attending that classroom. It's usually a smaller number of students with a higher number of professionals there. So you often have teachers and related service providers, PTs, OTs, behavior interventionists in that classroom. And that is the classroom the students attend all day, except for they may join other kids for specials and things like that. But really their class is that self-contained classroom, which is separated from their peers without disabilities. Then you can go on to more specialized placements, like a self-contained school. And then we have things all the way up through residential treatment centers to psychiatric units, psychiatric hospitals, things like that. So there's a large continuum. And whenever you're considering placement, the law says you have to consider where is the best place for them to be educated. And you can't just say, well, it's this. You have to say why. Like, why is this the best place for them? What is it going to provide them? Because the goal, obviously, is for them to have not just academic and emotional, behavioral, social instruction. It's also for them to socialize with their peers. So the push is always for how can we include them as much as we can, but while getting them the best education they can receive. And so the law says we must consider the least restrictive environment, which is a continuum. So when I teach my students, I'm quick to remind them that really, if you want to get down to it, if you're arguing for full inclusion, meaning a one size fits all, every student in this place every time, you're actually arguing for a violation of the law as it stands today. Doesn't mean laws may not change, but so that's really why when we consider what is the right placement, what is a self-contained versus an inclusive setting, we consider this because the law says we should, and the law says we should because we have decades of research showing that where a student is educated does have an impact on their outcomes, for better or worse. And it doesn't mean that one setting is right for every student, in my opinion. Personally, I believe that a fully inclusive approach is right for many students. And there are many students with disabilities who are educated in a fully inclusive setting, and it works because teachers are trained to work with these students and it's successful. But there's also many cases where it isn't successful. And the fully inclusive classroom is not the best place for the student every time. And it just depends on what that student's unique need is. And I'll end this diatribe real quick to say, one of the things I think a lot of people, so two things. One is we should acknowledge the history of self-contained settings. And so when Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, I believe, the case came about, which basically desegregated the schools by law, that we're no longer going to have this separate but equal approach to schooling, that all schools should be integrated along racial lines. There should be no division. That in the wake of that, many school districts in the country used self-contained settings as a way to continue segregation. So many students, many minority students were disproportionately placed in self-contained settings because the schools were seeking a way to continue segregation. So they were still separating white students from non-white students. I shouldn't phrase it that way, but they were still separating students along racial lines, and self-contained settings or schools were a way to do it. So fully acknowledge there is a racialized, racist history to self-contained settings, but there's been a lot of work in progress done in the interim, and there is still an issue today of certain students from certain backgrounds get referred for behavior issues where it's more of a cultural misunderstanding than anything. But in my opinion, it doesn't mean that self-contained settings today, as they operate, as we train people to work in those settings, as the people in those settings do really amazing work, and the students in those settings really benefit, that we should say that all self-contained settings are bad and shouldn't be used. Because I personally have sat in IEP meetings where the IEP team was kind of pushing to remove the student from self-contained, to have more of an inclusive class. And the parent and the student were both like, don't want that. Like they did not want to go to the general education classroom more often because it wasn't the right fit for them. They felt like they were doing well. They were making progress in the self-contained setting. And so for me, I mean, it's anecdotal evidence, but I've seen it with my own eyes where not every student wants that setting. Not every parent wants that setting for their child. So it's important to me that we consider the continuum as the law says we should, but which means we must consider the mental health of the professionals working in those settings, and also the mental health of the folks who are the general education teachers. I would be much more comfortable with a full inclusion approach if I felt like our teachers were ready for that. But I don't think they are. And it's not because they're not great or amazing at what they do. It's because we don't fully prepare them for that, because I've yet to see a setting where we can say, this is how you do full inclusion, like 100%. This is what it actually looks like when it works. For every student, I don't know that exists. And so we're kind of advocating for a model that we haven't proven is the most beneficial model.
Well, we also have a situation right now where I agree with you. There is no profession you're going to find where there aren't ill-equipped people working in that profession, or haven't had the proper training or experience in that profession. And we know that is becoming more and more likely, actually, in our profession. And it's because we're deprofessionalizing the profession. We're making it much easier for teachers to do the little things that they need to do on the side in order to have a teaching license in some states and be in the classroom and be in charge of 30 kids at a time when they've barely had any kind of real training, any kind of particularly with students with challenging students, with kids who have some challenging behaviors or have some severe academic challenges that they're struggling with. So I agree with you. I think that when you have this one size fits all model, first of all, that never works. I mean, come on, you guys, when have you ever ordered a one size fits all anything that's actually fit you?
Yeah.
But I'm even more concerned about it as we move into this next year and future years, as we are creating policy that's allowing states and districts and schools to hire teachers basically with no training at all.
Yeah, these alternative certification pathways. And so, you mentioned before, one of the biggest things teachers complain about or struggle with is behavior management. And the vast majority, I mean, not even every traditional certification program requires a course in classroom behavior management. Not even all of those do. Certainly, the majority of alternative cert programs are not putting people through enough training in behavior management. And so, when I say we, I mean like researchers have been asking teachers since the 80s that lead the profession early, what's the reason you left? And the number one reason consistently for now going on 40 plus years is behaviors. They could not manage the behaviors of the students. And so and that isn't a knock on teachers that they're not good at their jobs. It's that they weren't trained to do it. And that in many cases, and then also students, I don't think anyone would deny that student behavior has become more complicated in the last 10 years, and now in the wake of
the last couple of years, it's off the charts. I mean,
right.
we just did like a statewide assessment and then aligned it with some, AEA data and NEA data. And I mean, it was striking.
Yeah. And so when you have lack of training combined with increased need, combined with society schools have become these almost like de facto mental health institutions because you don't have the proper social services in our country to address the mental health issues among many of our youth. I mean,
yeah.
Can we hire 25 school counselors and school psychologists in every school? Of course, we can't do that. So again, to me, that's where it comes down to. If you have an increasing emotional behavioral health struggle among students, and more of those students are in general education classrooms because many students struggle with mental health, are not identified as having a disability. So they're in that classroom as well. And then, so what you then have is so the term that is used for students who actually receive services for mental health, the term that the government has is emotional disturbance. It's a horrible term. It's terribly stigmatizing. It's been used disproportionately, especially among Black students. It's an awful term. I wish it was something else. I mean, I actually was among the organization Council for Exceptional Children, which is our big national organization. The subgroup that focused on these students used to be called the Council for Children with Behavior Disorders. And even that is somewhat stigmatizing. So now it's referred to as the Division for Emotional and Behavioral Health, which is less stigmatizing. And I was involved with the group that helped make that change. So I'm 100% understanding that that's a terrible label. But anyway, what it means is that because there's so many students with mental health struggles, we have not seen a massive uptick in identification of this disability in school. So what that means is many kids who probably should be getting this label because they need services are not getting it. And the ones who do are exhibiting such extreme distress that they require a really focused approach, which again, to me, if you can show me an inclusive classroom where the student can get what they need, I'm all for it. Go for it.
Yeah.
But I'm not in favor of it just because, people will say, well, it's a civil rights issue. Well, I'm on board with you. Like, education is a civil rights issue, access to peers, all of that. I'm on board. But what I care about first and foremost is children are in school for a limited amount of time. You age out eventually. When you reach age 21, it's goodbye. Once beyond that, you don't get free education anymore. So we have limited time with these students. They need to be educated as best as we can before they leave us. And so if this student with extreme needs can get their better education in a self-contained setting, that might mean less socialization with their peers outside of that classroom. But to me, it's worthwhile exploring the self-contained setting because, again, I've seen enough. I've worked with students. I've done research with students. I've talked with parents. I've been in IP meetings where I've seen that is the setting that works. My former institution, I worked at Appalachian State University in Western Carolina, a pretty rural area, and there was a self-contained program within the school. And there were more professionals in that classroom than there were students because of the intense level of need. And the students were getting a great education. They were actually these were students with really complex needs. And they were getting the help that they needed because they had a team, again, of psychologists and child psychiatric personnel, all kinds of folks around helping them, social workers. That program has since been discontinued. And it wasn't because it wasn't helping the students. It was because programs like that are expensive.
It's so terribly expensive. Yeah.
It's really easy for governments to cut those programs in the name of, well, we should fully include all children. Is that really the reason you're doing it? Or are you cutting it because it's really expensive to have a program like that? And it's the same reason why our mental health system as a society struggles, is because it's really expensive to do proper mental health care. So I'm a little wary of people who cut programs and they say, well, we shouldn't have them because civil rights issue, they should be fully included. There are some people who genuinely advocate that, and I'm all for them and believe that. And we need people like that who've brought us so far. And, since 1975, when the law first came about, so many pioneers pushed forward and have brought so many more rights to parents and children, all for it. But I think if you look at a self-contained class, some people who don't like them will call them segregated settings. You can also call it a specialized setting. And how you choose to frame it, I think, informs really where you're coming from on the issue. It's just like with special education. I always tell my students, because a lot of students I work with, especially undergraduates, have heard different things about special education. And we have lots of students who minor in special education. So they want to be elementary teachers and they minor in special ed. And they have a lot of them have often a negative view of special education. And what I always say to them is, okay, imagine you have a child and you're sending them off to school. And when you're meeting with the principal and the principal says, hey, just so you're aware, in this school, we have amazing resources. We have amazing athletic facilities. We have top line mental health professionals, the best nutritious lunch you can imagine. It's all farm to table. And we also have this really great program where if we notice your child is struggling in any one of these academic, social, emotional areas, we have an entire team of people who will meet, sit down with them, figure out their needs, and figure out how to get them the best education possible during the school day, where they won't miss any important things like, specials and things like that with their peers. And by the way, it's totally free. There's no charge for this. No parent or person who cares about children would argue against that. But that is what special education is.
Yeah.
Now, does special education come up short in areas? Absolutely it does. Like everything does. Every product you purchase, everything you go for, every school has goals and they don't always reach them. It doesn't mean that special education doesn't have room to grow and areas to improve. We certainly do. But I think there's a little bit of the throwing the baby out with the bathwater that happens too much with self-contained classrooms, special education in general.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that this conversation has really, I hope, highlighted that, not just special education, actually, but education in school communities in general. There's so much nuance that you have to consider. It's so complex in terms of laws and policies and rules and codes, where a school is situated, what kind of community they're serving, how those, what teachers are being fed into that particular school or that particular district, where are they coming from, how are they being trained, what are the unique needs of that community and the families within that community, what kind of wraparound services are, every district and even schools within districts just are so, there's so much differentiation. There's so not differentiation, but there's so much difference between, and I've been traveling across the state of Iowa a lot in my job over the last few years. And, this is really, I knew it before, but like, I really understand it now. And I think that, it's really dangerous for us to it's the same with a wellness plan. It's the same with people's wellness journeys. You can't just say that, these are the 5 things that Justin, you need to do to achieve a certain state of well-being. You're a completely different person than I am. That's the things that work for me and that are doable and realistic for me could be completely off the table for you. Like I'm not going to do any kind of fasting. I know it works for some people, but that's out for me. That will never happen.
Not doing no cold plunges, nothing like that.
I know. I mean, I know the research behind this, like cold therapy, and there's more and more and more that like really supports it. But for me, for my well-being is about joy, experiencing joy. And of course you have to go through like some hard moments to get to like, your 80% like level of joy. Right. But, cold is not going to get me there. I'm not doing it.
Yeah. I read somewhere recently that like, there's this longevity research that says like a 2-minute cold shower every morning. And I tried it a couple of days ago and I was like, 20 seconds, I can do this, but 2 minutes every day in the cold. If it was a lukewarm shower, I could do it, but 2 minutes in a cold shower is a long time. So I know we're getting off track a little bit, but this is a wellness podcast, so an educator wellness. So I actually just read a study, and I'm trying to remember where. I can't even remember where it came out of. It actually was literally like 2 nights ago. I'll have to come back and put it in the show notes, but sure. It actually, what they were saying about cold therapy was that it's not actually like there's some of the things about the coldness on your body, like that impacts like basically health, right? But it had more to do with pushing, which this totally makes sense to me, like pushing through that moment, or like you're putting your body in a prolonged period of stress. I read the same thing. I can't remember where it came from, but yes.
I can't either. I think it was a good study.
It was really interesting that like the idea that like we've been taught forever that like stress, like, if you go to your I go to my doctor and they give me a physical check and they say everything looks good, your cholesterol is great, how's your stress level? Mm-hmm. And they always remind you that like stress is the silent killer and all this kind of stuff. But a certain amount of stress seems to be like, because if you're not stressing yourself at all, then you're not activating that part of your brain that like has that survival instinct and blah blah blah. So yeah, and I think that when I talk about burnout with people, I always mention it. I'll teach us, burnout is not just stress. It's more than that. Burnout is the inability to, at a certain point, handle too much stress. But we don't want to have a life where there's no stress. I mean, some people thrive under stress. Some people need stress to be productive. Some people, if they don't feel stressed, they get complacent and they get lazy and they aren't motivated to work. So, it's not that we're trying to create a situation for teachers where everything is,
easy,
rainbows and unicorns. It's that, hey, we're trying to help you manage the stress that you deal with, because you're working with human beings, whatever the student's label is or isn't. If you're working with kids in general today, going back to your point about how much there's mental health among students these days, you're going to face stress. You're going to have secondary, stress responses to you'll hear. I'll never forget when I was getting my teaching license, I was being trained back then to be like an English teacher, and this really great professor, I loved him. He referred to us all as soldiers. And his point was that like, we were going into battle, that like, and his point was that like, if you work with kids, especially adolescents, who we were all training for then, that you're going to hear horrific things, that you're going to meet children who are just dealing with some of the hardest circumstances you can imagine. You need to like be ready for that. Like you can't let that, not that you can always leave it at the school, but you can't take it home with you every day, that you have to find a time to like turn it off. And as educators, I think we struggle with that because we do tend to bring those stories home with us, and it's hard to just compartmentalize. But I try to remind people when I work with them that, if you really need to focus on that, because if you can't turn it off, if you can't compartmentalize completely, if you're never turning that part off, then that stress will just build and build, and you will kind of absorb somebody else's trauma, let alone your own. So it's not an easy thing. I often get people that will want me to come and talk, or students will ask me, they want like what's the magic thing? What's this one thing I can do? What's the cranberry juice of mental health for burnout? And there is none. I always remind people to I'm quick to say what really, I'll say grinds my gears, such a funny expression, but really grinds my gears is when you see all these suggestions to teachers who are burning out, that what they should do is, hey, well, if you're burning out, you should start doing yoga and maybe do some mindful breathing, and also join a book club and also exercise. And they get this laundry list of like 17 things they should do. And that's overwhelming.
Overwhelming.
It doesn't mean that some of those things aren't great. They are, but it's almost like if you're feeling burned out, where you're on the edge of quitting or just mentally tapping out and being less effective at your job, like you're not going to all of a sudden start doing all of those things. I don't do yoga. For me, my mental health stuff that I do is like I chop wood. I do landscaping, that kind of stuff calms me down. I've tried yoga. It's really hard. I wasn't good at it and I didn't really enjoy it. So I started doing other things. And so for me, manual labor is calming more so than some other stuff. And so I think what I see is this kind of one size fits all approach of this package of like, hey, if you're burning out, here's 3 things you should start doing. And it's always yoga, mindful breathing, and that kind of stuff. And those things are great. My wife's a big advocate for those and does those things. But again, I think burnout, just like any intervention for students, any placement for students, there's no one size fits all approach for a teacher dealing with burnout. And
no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, sometimes you have to just advocate for just rest. I mean, I think one of the best things you can do when you when you're wanting to improve your whole well-being or your wellness journey, as I always say, well, instead of going to the gym and trying to like kill yourself, in something you don't really even like doing,
right,
why don't you just try sleeping for a while? If that seems to be an issue for you. And most people that I talk to, they tell me about they have some pretty severe sleep issues in terms of being able to sleep through the night, or not being able to go to bed until 4:00 in the morning. Then they have to be up at 6, to get ready for work or what have you. Sometimes it's rest.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, my 8-year-old daughter, she's, she's amazing, but I'm trying to get her to learn some of these strategies already at her young age. And so she has a Fitbit, and really she has it because she likes tracking how many steps she gets. She's an athlete. She's young. She's an athlete, but she also, it's for me, I have her because of sleep. And so we've kind of found that the magic number, if Ava gets less than 10 hours of sleep, it's not going to be a good day for her. And so lots of times we will not let her, but we'll let her experience the consequence of her messing around, staying up too late, and then her body wants to wake up at a certain time, and we look at her Fitbit and, you got 8 hours and 50 minutes, and that isn't enough for you, and today might be hard, so let's remember that. And so then throughout the day, when she's struggling with whatever it might be, it's a reminder of this is why sleep is important. So something as simple as getting proper rest and figuring out how much your body needs too. That's such a variable thing, but I love that idea of if you don't like the gym, and if you hate doing something, don't go do it. That's not the solution.
It's not sustainable. But it's the same thing with what we're talking about with education and different learning environments too.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we're forcing kids to be in a particular learning environment, it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable for the teacher. It's not sustainable for that child. It's not sustainable for the other children that are involved in that particular room or learning environment. And so it's the same kind of thing in a way of thinking. You can't, if there's anything I think that I hope our audience has learned from you today, Justin, it's that you need to be open. You need to be open to doing things in different ways for different people in different environments.
And that's, why I think it's important to people, when we talk about, again, within special education, because those are the only students receiving services, are the ones that are going to be placed into a separate setting. The first I of an IEP, it's individualized. Mm-hmm. It's not, it's not a one size fits all education plan. It's an individualized plan. And so, a big thing we do when we train people to develop really high quality IEPs is to make sure we include the student-led IEPs. Mm-hmm. So asking them what they want. And I do see more and more, again, anecdotal, like more and more things like social anxieties and phobias where kids don't like being in those large group settings. And so what sense does it make if a student is in this setting and they're making some progress? And I do get a little bit frustrated with the research community on this, because they do studies where they say, well, students in self-contained classrooms don't make gains as well as similar students in inclusive environments. So okay, well, that's a really hard study to do properly, partly because, well, maybe the reason the self-contained classroom, the students in self-contained are making less progress is because they have more extreme needs than those kids who are being educated. So I've yet to see a study where they've said, here's like 1,000 kids with this profile. Here's 1,000 more with the same exact profile. And let's put them in 2 different settings and see who does better. That study doesn't exist. Yet when we talk about settings, we pretend like it does exist. And I'm not advocating for separating kids. I'm not advocating for keeping general education only kids without disabilities. Not at all. I am all for full inclusion. I taught a class at my previous course or my previous university on inclusion. The course is called inclusion. I'm all for inclusion. I teach about it now. But I also worry about teachers in the self-contained settings. And so, the things you're hearing in the news about inclusion and full inclusion and all that is the same things I'm hearing. And who else is hearing it are teachers working in self-contained settings. And so I just finished a study where, long story short, I had 3 teachers who worked in self-contained settings, 2 of them self-contained classrooms, 1 a self-contained school. And I was discussing their burnout. And I had all these reasons I thought they may have been burning out. Behavior issues, relationship, what it came down to for them, the biggest contributor to their burnout was kind of the national narrative that they felt like they were kind of being demonized in the national narrative around education, that because they worked in a self-contained setting and self-contained settings were bad, that therefore they are bad. And these are people who are like, oh my gosh, I come in every day. I absorb the trauma my students are dealing with. I love my students. I will die for them. I would do anything for them. I've spent so many hours after school, before school, weekends to help them. Yet, and they're doing the really hard emotional labor of schooling. Yet there's this narrative that they're doing something that's violating these kids' rights. And so I think we need to be very careful in the research community of how we talk about inclusion. We should push towards a world where full inclusion is possible and makes sense and is beneficial to all. But I don't think we're anywhere near that point. Doesn't mean it's not worth climbing that mountain, but along the way, we shouldn't sacrifice students or teachers on the altar of, hey, we should all be fully inclusive. Like that's so, and just like some people have that horrible expression, like those who can do, those who can't teach, which drives me crazy. I hate that expression. It's like, if you want to argue for a fully inclusive, okay, well then you go to a fully inclusive classroom with 23 students, and these are all the different levels of need. And you show me that every one of those students in that classroom got the best education possible. I don't know that we're doing that.
Yeah. And I think that you would be hard pressed. I mean, I know that there are some teachers who advocate for the opposite, but I think that, you'd be hard pressed to find a teacher these days who's been working in buildings consistently in full inclusion environments who wouldn't agree. I mean, it's the other end. I mean, because I've worked in classrooms where, you know, we definitely embrace full inclusion, and it's those teachers struggle in the same ways, and that, you know, what's wrong with me? Why can't I make this work? You know, I've done all the things. You know, I've had school psychs come in and observe. I've had special education teachers come in and observe me. I've had my school administrators. I've taken these extra courses. I've, you know, done all the things, and I still feel like I'm, you know, coming up short. And then you see teachers leaving the profession because they feel like they're inadequate.
And it's really important too. You reminded me that when we talk about like special education is such a huge umbrella, and there's students with so many different needs there. So if we're talking about a fully inclusive environment for students with maybe some physical health needs, that's a very different case than a student with severe mental health needs. And so I do think, I mean, I'm not saying that no area is easier than the other, but I think that in terms of a fully inclusive approach, it is much easier and much more possible to fully include those students with physical needs. And I've seen wonderful classrooms that did this in North Carolina, in New York, in Tennessee, in Vermont. So when I say I've never seen it for kids with the serious mental health issues. I've seen it for kids with serious physical health issues. And it's been like heartwarming to see that the student, like it's just a great thing to see. So on that note, that full inclusion I'm on board with, because it can be done. It costs more, it's harder, but then once it's happening, it's easier because like this is the best possible. This is the utopia we would love to see for our students with this serious mental health concerns. So it's the push for full inclusion of all students, meaning that would include the students with mental health, that concerns me for the reasons you said. And then we have teachers who, whether they're general ed or whoever they are, that they're not fully prepared, so they feel inadequate. And then, so you get teacher turnover, and we know that teacher turnover is bad for students. It's not just the budgets of the schools that suffer, the students in schools with higher turnover do less well. Teachers of students who are the teachers that are burning out, those students do less well. They achieve their goals less often. So again, where I came back to with my grant was why I said, again, we can have all these great interventions, but if we don't care more about teachers, it's not going to move the needle the way we need it to.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end it too. I mean, this is supposed to be about teachers and helping teachers, giving them some good advice and letting them know that we see them and we see their hard work and their support and dedication, and are, you know, sharing our concern and expertise with them. So I love that.
Yeah, one more thing I would say is that on that note of teachers, I always remind my students, either my students who are studying to be teachers or students or master students who are getting, you know, professional development who are currently working, is that like they are, and I always say to them, you are a highly in-demand commodity, and to not devalue yourself, and to realize that if you're in a work environment where you're not being respected, that, you know, to advocate for yourself. You know, I always tell them, you know, that you, like, someone choosing to be an educator today is a really brave and admirable choice. And you should really, and that self-advocacy is so important, to speak up for your rights and for yourself, and to not learn to say no to things that you might be being put on your plate. Because if you say yes to everything, there's not going to be enough for you at the end of the day. So just always say thank you to all the teachers who still do what they do, because I'm not in the classroom right now. And I have children who are in classrooms, and I see the hard work being done. So
yeah, I 100% agree. Well, thank you, Justin, for joining us today. It was really nice to be able to have a long chat with you, and for you to share your expertise with all of our Iowa educators and educators beyond who are joining us. So thank you.
So my conversation today with Justin has me thinking more about the human tendency to try to use dichotomous thinking to address really complex human issues, and how dangerous that type of thinking can really be for all of us. We, of course, need policies and evidence-based frameworks in place to help us make individualized decisions for students that best meet their educational learning goals and needs, which is why it's important to remember that full inclusion isn't necessarily the best choice for all students all the time. In fact, sometimes it can be rather harmful. Finding that right balance is crucial, right? Finding the balance between self-contained classrooms and when to use full inclusive environments is really what we're examining here. I think the key to ensure that the placement decision aligns with the individual needs of the students, promoting both academic and social development while also providing adequate support for educators is crucial. It's what's necessary. And that adequate support for educators, that continuous professional development, that continuous training and conversations, honest conversations with families is at the heart of all of this. But I would also love to hear your thoughts on this topic or ideas for future episodes. I invite you to share your comments, your stories, and suggestions with me at scsmh-maine@uiowa.edu. Thank you for joining me today, and until next time, I'm Dr. Kari Vogelgesang, forever cheering you on.